Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Ulysses S. Grant, Part 13, Bankruptcy, Illness, and Final Victory in 1885. We stopped last time in 1885. Ulysses S. Grant was in the last year of his life. He'd lost all his money because of a crooked business partner of his son. He was very sick. In fact, he was dying. And he was writing his memoirs. He'd come up with a good deal with Mark Twain, and he was hoping he could finish writing his memoirs before his death, and that the memoirs would sell well. They would be a 2-volume set, and that his wife Julia would be okay financially after his death, and his family. And that's exactly what happened. And that was his final victory, finishing that writing and having his memoir support well Julia after his departure. Ulysses S. Grant wrote in 1885, quote, "I always admired the South, as bad as I thought their cause for the boldness with which they silenced all opposition and all croaking by press or individuals within their control. War should be avoided if at all possible, but once entered into, it is too much for human nature to tolerate an enemy within their ranks, to give aid and comfort to the opposing section or nation." Historian Charles Bracelin Flood wrote about Ulysses S. Grant raced to finish his writing before his death, quote, "Mark Twain understood what was at stake, not only for Grant and himself, but the nation. What can this historic man impart to us all before he succumbs to death? And his experience and wisdom will be lost to all of us." On March 1st, 1885, the New York Times headline was, "Grant is dying." The national press was outside of Grant's New York City home. He received telegrams from Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee's sons. Black Americans loved Grant and were praying for him. He was very sick. It was national news, a spectacle. On March 4th, Congress renewed Grant's commission in the Army. However, it was too late. It was 12:20 in the morning, the end of the session. They turned the clock back and signed the bill to renew his commission. In March, Jefferson Davis wrote, quote, "General Grant is dying. Instead of seeking to disturb the quiet of his closing hours, I would, if it were in my power, contribute to his peace of mind and comfort of his body." Grant's response was, quote, "I am very glad to hear this. I would much rather have their goodwill than their ill will. I would rather have the goodwill of any man than his ill will." Grant was happy to die a full general. He continued writing. His memory was good. The guy who cost him all his money, Ferdinand Ward, served 6 years in Sing Sing prison for his crime. Grant had a very bad cough, and it was treated with cocaine and morphine. He wrote a letter asking a future president regarding his son, Fred's son Ulysses, if he would accept him at West Point. In 1898, William McKinley honored that request. There was a crowd outside his home. Grant was touched. He was grateful for the public support. He also received a telegram from Queen Victoria from Great Britain. Mark Twain admired Grant's humility. There was conflict with Adam Badeau, his secretary. Badeau had become very arrogant, and Grant dismissed him. His daughter Nellie came from England for the end of his life. Harrison Terrell was his butler, valet, nurse. He was born a slave and devoted to Grant. He became the first black municipal judge in Washington, D.C., and was a friend of Booker T. Washington. Grant became more productive after Badeau departed. He worked hard writing his memoirs, which he dedicated to Union and Confederate soldiers. On Memorial Day, there were 400 veterans passed by his house. May 30th was Decoration Day. A parade of veterans passed Grant's house in New York City. They took off their hats. Their cheeks were bathed in tears. It was manly grief. Grant was inside the home and could see them out the window and gave his last salute. Grant said to the veterans, quote, "Tell the boys they are engraved on my heart, and I love them as my children." The orders for Grant's memoir at this point were 100,000. Mark Twain predicted that he would sell 300,000 sets. In May, Grant traveled to the home of a friend, Joseph W. Drexel, in Saratoga Springs, New York. It was a resort with mineral waters and Pine Mountain air. On June 16th, they traveled. He traveled in a railroad, private car of William H. Vanderbilt. Grant wrote a letter to the Grand Army of the Republic veterans in the state of Maine and said, quote, "Tell the boys that they probably will never look into my face again, nor hear my voice, but they are engraved on my heart, and I love them as my children." Civil War Union veterans in Cleveland, Ohio wrote a letter to Grant which went, quote, "With hearts surcharged with the tenderest affection, we send to you our most sincere sympathy in this hour of your great physical suffering. Our love for you only broadens and deepens as time passes. God bless you." Grant's doctors scoured the dead matter in his throat. He continued writing, but he was starving. He couldn't eat. He couldn't talk. Grant wrote, quote, "I am glad to say that while there is much unblushing wickedness in this world, yet there is a compensating goodness of the soul." Grant was dying. Soldiers, Union and Confederate, were concerned. There was national reconciliation. He reconciled with Benjamin Bristow, who had been his Treasury Secretary, and they became estranged because of Bristow's role in the whiskey ring scandal. Grant apologized to him for their estrangement. He was at the end of his life. There were visitors. John C. Fremont came, the sons of Robert E. Lee and Albert Sidney Johnston. On July 20th, Grant finished writing his memoirs. On July 22nd, 2 days later, he was near death. Everyone was very sad. Grant wrote, quote, "I don't want anybody to feel distressed on my account." July 16th, another report said that he finished his memoirs, the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. They're considered a masterpiece. The preface he wrote, quote, "Man proposes and God disposes." Julia eventually received $450,000 from the sales of the book. On July 20th, Grant was taken to the scenic spot at a mountaintop in the Adirondack Mountains. On July 23rd, he died. He had written, "I hope no one will be distressed on my account." At his death, he weighed 90 pounds. Grant was grateful to the generosity of New York City citizens. After Grant's death, the New Orleans Times Democrat newspaper wrote, quote, "Vanquished by his arms in his chivalric kindness, we were doubly vanquished at Appomattox." Again, he died on July 23rd at 8:06 a.m. His son, Fred, stopped the clock. This was a Victorian custom. The clock remained forever frozen at the moment Grant died. So it was no longer a functioning clock after that. Grant's death was a perfect time for national celebration and reunification. 1 week after his death, his body was still in the cottage where he died. The question was where he would be buried. On August 5th, his body was taken by train to New York City. It passed Fishkill, New York. It rolled over coins there on the tracks, which had been placed for keepsakes by individuals. Confederate General James Longstreet wrote, quote, "Ulysses S. Grant was a great general, but the best thing about him was his heart." At Appomattox, Grant had given generous treatment to a fallen foe. This produced a thrill of grateful recognition in the heart of the South. Again, Confederate General James Longstreet. Ulysses S. Grant was a great general, but the best thing about him was his heart. So Ulysses S. Grant had died. Historian H.W. Brands wrote, quote, "The South joined the North and West in commemorating his virtues. New Orleans and Richmond matched New York City and Chicago in celebrating the life well lived." H.W. Brands continued, quote, "The American Indians, like the African Americans, could not claim lasting success for Grant's endeavors on their behalf. His struggle for minority rights faced majority hostility and indifference and was a battle he couldn't win, but he waged a good and honorable fight." On August 5th, there was a Puck newspaper cartoon, and there was the slogan, "Peace and goodwill of all men." There was a wreath placed on a statue of Grant in the cartoon. along with Southern soldiers and Northern soldiers, and an African American with the quote, "Our friend." Julia decided to bury Grant in New York City. Grant's casket traveled from Albany to New York City. 300,000 people filed past the coffin in City Hall. His funeral was on August 8th. 1.5 million people came to the funeral. Walt Whitman wrote, quote, "Out of all the hubbub of the war, Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant emerged, the towering, majestic figures." At the funeral was President Grover Cleveland, former Presidents Rutherford B. Hayes and Chester A. Arthur, along with 15 senators, 12 congressmen, and 18 governors. At the funeral, William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan were pallbearers, along with 2 Union generals, along with Confederate generals Joseph Johnston and Simon Buckner. Union and Confederate soldiers. Black veterans came. There were 60,000 soldiers at his funeral. Black churches became places of meetings of sorrow. Frederick Douglass wrote, quote, "In him the Negro found a protector, the Indian a friend, a vanquished foe a brother, an imperiled nation a savior." August 8th, the funeral of Ulysses S. Grant. There were displays of grief in New York City. A poor colored bootblack had a sign, quote, "He helped to set me free." Two Confederate pallbearers, Simon Bolivar at Buckner and Joseph Johnson, both wore their Confederate uniforms in the funeral procession. 60,000 people marched, including 18,000 members of the Grand Army of the Republic. No presidential death achieved national reconciliation more than Grant's death. Confederate veterans marched in their Richmond Grays and the Stonewall Jackson Brigade. July 24th, New York City Mayor William Grace wrote a letter to prominent New Yorkers regarding building Grant's tomb. Those people included Chester A. Arthur, Roscoe Conkling, John Jacob Astor, Joseph Pulitzer, and Hamilton Fish. There was a fundraising effort. September 26th, there was a baseball game between the Albany Commercial Travelers against the Troy Commercial Travelers, raising money for Grant's tomb. $500 was donated by Chinese Viceroy Li Hung Chang, who had met Grant on his trip around the world. William Tecumseh Sherman believed Wall Street killed Grant. A temporary brick tomb was built at Riverside Drive, 122nd Street, New York City. At the funeral cortege, Sherman stood straight, his body shaking with tears. At the end of 1885, the Grant Monument Association had raised $111,000. There was a long way to go to have the money to build Grant's tomb. In 1887, in May, Julia's royalties from Grant's memoirs reached $394,000. Total eventually reached $450,000, equal to $13 million today. In 1889, Grant's son, Fred, was frustrated by the lack of progress regarding Grant's tomb. In a New York World interview, Fred talked about Grant's interest in being buried in St. Louis, Missouri, Galena, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. This put pressure on the Grant Memorial Association to raise more money to build Grant's tomb. In 1890, the Grant Memorial Association picked a Grant tomb design, which had been produced by John Hemingway Duncan. It only took 5 years. The design was based on the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which was the tomb of the Persian king Mausolus from 353 B.C. This is the origin of the word mausoleum, a building which has human remains. April 27, 1891, there was a ceremonial groundbreaking for Grant's tomb at Riverside Park in New York City. April 27, 1892, they laid the cornerstone ceremony for Grant's tomb. There were commemorative medals. One side was the image of the tomb, and the other side had images of Grant, Lincoln, and George Washington. Father, Savior, and Defender. President Benjamin Harrison attended the ceremony. $200,000 were raised in the past 30 days, more than the previous 7 years. The fundraising efforts were due to Edward F. Cragen, However, they were still short of the goal. By 1892, the $600,000 were raised for Grant's tomb. They had enough money for everything. In June, this was the victory in their fundraising. It was the largest public fundraising done in American history, mostly donations from New York City people. In 1893, Grant's widow Julia and Verena Davis, the widow of Jefferson Davis, were good friends in New York City, where they both lived. Julia wrote in her personal memoirs about her husband, Ulysses S. Grant, quote, "Even though his beautiful life has gone out, it is as when some far-off planet disappears from the heavens. The light of his glorious fame reaches to me, falls upon me, and warms me." 1897, April 12th, Grant's tomb was finished. April 27th was the dedication of Grant's tomb. Andrew Carnegie and Theodore Roosevelt attended. 2 songs were inspired, the Grant Memorial Day March and Two-Step and Here Sleeps the Hero. There was a parade including the Nez Perce Indian Chief Joseph and Buffalo Bill. There were banners, "Let us have peace," all over New York City. The National Parks Service regarding Grant's tomb, quote, in a very real sense, Grant's tomb symbolizes an entire generation's feelings, not just about Grant, but about the Civil War and the role every foot soldier played in it. In 1897, New Yorkers had great pride in Grant's tomb. It was a powerful sense of place for Civil War veterans. Civil War veterans visited Grant's tomb like a religious pilgrimage. There was a "Remove Your Hat" sign posted during the peak years. They requested guests to speak in hushed whispers. It was a popular destination for bicycle riders. Till the end of the 19th century, there were 500,000 visitors per year. Grant's tomb was 150-foot tall neoclassical. It is the largest tomb in North America, completed in 1897, the most popular destination in New York City for many years, a sacred, revered shrine. Hundreds of thousands made pilgrimage every year, Union and Confederate veterans celebrating reunification of the United States of America. In 1897, William McKinley dedicated the General Grant National Memorial, also known as Grant's Tomb. It was financed by the public. The leader of the fundraising was Richard T. Greener, who was the first black graduate of Harvard College. It's an opulent dome with granite and marble, the largest mausoleum in North America. Julia died in 1902 and was buried there. New York City, Grant's tomb was the #1 tourist attraction for many years. There were 500,000 annual visitors. Going back to the funeral, after the funeral, William Tecumseh Sherman and Mark Twain met and had a good talk. In 1898, Grant's son Frederick was a major general in the Philippines, in the Spanish-American War and the Philam War. 1902, as we said, December 14th, Julia Grant died at age 76 in Washington, D.C., and her remains were brought to Grant's tomb. 1904, there was a silent, short, romantic comedy movie called Personal, involving a love-sick French bachelor chased by a number of available women in front of Grant's tomb. In 1905, there was another short, silent, romantic comedy movie, How a French Nobleman Got a Wife, through the New York Herald Personal column. Same plot also by Grant's tomb. 1909, the New York City had the Hudson Fulton celebration, 300 years since Henry Hudson arrived in New York and 100 years since Robert Fulton invented the steamboat. They had an aviator competition. Wilbur Wright and Glenn Curtis flew from the southern tip of Manhattan to Grant's tomb. Curtis didn't make it. Wright did, and he won the award. 1 million people watched that. In the 1910s to 1920s, attendance at Grant's tomb was 300,000 a year. In the early 1920s, 6-year-old John F. Kennedy visited. He was told that Ulysses S. Grant was buried there. The young Kennedy said, quote, "Whiskers and all?" 1930s, there was a big attendance drop due to the Great Depression. People didn't have money. 1933, only 95,000 people came. there was renovation by the Works Progress Administration. 1936, there was a romantic comedy movie called Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. And Gary Cooper played a character named Longfellow Deeds, commenting on Grant's tomb, quote, "To most people, it's an awful letdown. To most people, it's a washout." And then Deeds said, quote, "Well, that depends on what they see. Me, I see a small Ohio farm boy becoming a great soldier. I see thousands of marching men. I see General Lee with a broken heart surrendering. And I can see the beginning of a new nation, like Abraham Lincoln said. And I can see that Ohio boy being inaugurated as president. Things like that can only happen in a country like America." The 1950s, there was You Bet Your Life, a TV show on NBC. The star was Groucho Marx. It was a quiz show. Who's buried in Grant's tomb became the most obvious answer, helping a hapless contestant. And in the 1950s, it became a famous joke. 1955, there was a gang battle near Grant's tomb. 200 boys and 6 rival gangs. It was turning into a dangerous area. 1959, on May 1st, Grant's tomb was It was a transfer of title from the Grant Monument Association to the National Park Service. It was 0.76 acres. The association was not able to afford maintenance of the tomb, and the name was the General Grant National Memorial. By 1965, Grant's tomb was neglected, in disrepair, vandalized, desecrated by junkies, prostitutes, and gang members. People were afraid to visit. The official name was General Grant National Memorial, also known as Grant's Tomb. In 1969, the New York City murder rate was increasing. Visitors to the tomb continued to decline. It was not safe to visit. There was a change from Grant's tomb being the most popular tourist attraction to one of the least visited, most dangerous sites. It was 2 blocks west of the edge of Harlem. 1972 was Grant's 150th birthday ceremony. At Grant's tomb, 24 people attended, and a third of the people in the crowd were gang members. 1979, the New York City murder rate was increasing. Attendance at Grant's tombs was only 35,000 a year. Grant's tomb had become a hangout for muggers, homeless people, drug dealers. There was graffiti, poor lighting, no tour guide, and no bathroom. In 1990, Frank Scaturo, a Columbia University student who was 18 years old, developed an interest in the life of Ulysses S. Grant and started visiting Grant's tomb. He wrote a 325-page report on Grant's tomb, which he distributed to the media, in which he said that Grant's tomb was a homeless shelter, a bathroom for homeless people, a place where people were taking drugs. In November of 1993, Scaturo was on the Sunday Today in New York City, a New York City show, talking about the problems related to Grant's tomb. 1994, there was a New York Times editorial. The title was Dishonor for a Hero President, regarding the state of Grant's tomb. There was a discussion to move Grant's remains to Illinois because of the terrible condition of Grant's tomb. This was initiated by the Illinois House of Representatives. A lawsuit was filed by Scaturo and Grant's family against the federal government regarding the neglect of Grant's tomb. A decision was made to spend $1.8 million to renovate Grant's tomb. In 1994, there were 54,000 visitors. After the following year, following renovations, that number went up to 115,000 visitors. By 1997, Grant's tomb was rededicated after renovation. In 2003, Grant's tomb was involved in the Macy's 4th of July Spectacular, in which Beyonce Knowles sang. In 1982, Grant ranked 36 out of the 39 U.S. presidents at the time. In 2018, he was 24th, so he was becoming more popular in recent years. Historian Ron Chernow wrote, quote, "Ulysses S. Grant was the single most person behind Reconstruction. Frederick Douglass said that President Lincoln and Grant did the most to help African Americans." Ulysses S. Grant said this about war. "It is at all times a sad and cruel business. I hate war with all my heart. and nothing but imperative duty could induce me to engage in its work or witness its horrors. Ron Chernow wrote, quote, Ulysses S. Grant was the son of an incorrigible small-town braggart. The unassuming general and two-time president harbored a lifelong aversion to boasting. He was content to march to his grave in dignified silence, letting his extraordinary wartime record speak for itself. Walt Whitman said this about Grant, quote, what a man he is, what a history, what an illustration, his life of the capacities of that American individuality common to us all. Ulysses S. Grant proves how an average Western farmer, mechanic, boatman, carried by tides of circumstances, perhaps caprices, into a position of incredible military or civic responsibilities, may steer his way fitly and steadily through them all, carrying the country and himself with credit, year after year, commanded over 1 million armed men, fight more than 50 pitched battles, rule for 8 years a land larger than all the kingdoms of Europe combined, and then, retiring quietly with a cigar in his mouth, make the promenade of the whole world, through its courts and coteries and kings and czars and mikados, as phlegmatically as he ever walked the portico of his Missouri hotel after dinner. Seems to me it transcends Plutarch, how those old Greeks would have seized on him. A mere plain man, no art, no poetry, a common trader, moneymaker, tanner, farmer of Illinois, general for the Republic. In the war of attempted secession, president following, a task of peace more difficult than the war itself. Nothing heroic, as the authorities put it, and yet the greatest hero. For these 13 videos, I read 9 books. Grant by Ron Chernow, 2017. Grant and Sherman, The Friendship That Won the Civil War by Charles Bracelin Flood, 2005. American Ulysses, A Life of Ulysses S. Grant, Ronald C. White, 2016. Grant and Twain, Mark Perry, 2004. Grant by Gene Edward Smith, 2001. Grant's Final Victory, Ulysses S. Grant's Heroic Last Year by Charles Bracelin Flood, 2011. The Man Who Saved the Union, Ulysses S. Grant in War and Peace by H.W. Brands, 2012. Grant's Tomb, The Epic Death of Ulysses S. Grant and the Making of an American Pantheon by Louis L. Piccone, 2021. And Who is Buried in Grant's Tomb, A Tour of Presidential Grave Sites by Brian Lamb and the staff of C-SPAN, 2010. So, in conclusion, Ulysses S. Grant was an amazing person. He shows the importance of good character. He had such a struggle trying to make a living and support his wife and children, and then but he was a good man. He was kind, hardworking, brave, patient, humble, and then when the Civil War came, all those qualities became important, and he was the most important general in winning the Civil War. President Lincoln kept looking for someone like Grant and finally found him, who was willing to fight these very terrible battles that had to be fought to defeat the South and to keep the United States one country. And certainly a very difficult task, but he did it. He served his country, helped President Lincoln and the Union soldiers win the Civil War, keep the United States one country. So he's lived an inspiring life, and his life certainly deserves to be remembered. And again, his success was based on the fact that he was a man of good character. He was kind, patient, hardworking, brave, humble, and didn't give up. God bless Ulysses S. Grant, a man who served his country well. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.